Between 8th and 9th centuries, three Indian powers fought for the control of Kannauj. We know this struggle as the tripartite struggle in which the Palas, the Pratiharas and the Rashtrakutas fought for the control of Kannauj. Now one question which could be asked is, why did Kannauj become such an important city during this period? Because if we look at the Gupta period, we find that Kannauj was not as important as it later became. So who were responsible for this rise of Kannauj? The answer to this question is the Maukharis. And in this video, we will talk about the history of these Maukharis and how they made the city of Kannauj the political and cultural capital of northern India. Now, when we talk about the Maukharis, we have to first look at the territory which they controlled. And it was the modern day Uttar Pradesh region which was the core of the Maukhari kingdom. This region during the Gupta period was under the Gupta Empire, and we know that when the Gupta Empire declined at the start of 6th century AD, it was the Huns who had occupied this region. We know that Torman was able to conquer the Ganga Valley up to the city of Varanasi. Now this rule of the Huns was short-lived because we know that Torman was defeated by the Aulikaras, and with this defeat the Huns retreated from parts of central India and Ganga Valley. Now the power vacuum that was created after this retreat of the Huns was filled by these Maukharis. The Maukharis earlier during the Gupta period were most probably the feudatory of the Gupta Empire, and their core territory during the Gupta period was the region of Bagelkhand. But with the retreat of the Huns at the start of 6th century AD, these Maukharis were able to take control of the Ganga Valley. Now this rise of the Maukharis happened during the reign of the Maukhari ruler Yashoda Varman, and it was the combined armies of the Maukhari ruler Yashoda Varman and the Aulikara ruler Yashoda Varman that defeated the Hunnic ruler Mihirkula. With this victory over the Huns, both the Aulikaras and the Maukharis were able to establish their independent power in their respective regions. But what we see is that Yashoda Varman, after this victory, did not proclaim himself as an independent ruler. Most likely at this point, he was still a nominal feudatory of the Imperial Guptas. The Imperial Guptas at this point only controlled the region of Magadh and the Bengal region. The Maukhari ruler who would proudly proclaim himself as an independent ruler was the son of Yashoda Varman, Ishan Varman. Ishan Varman, in one of his inscriptions, calls himself Maharajadhiraj. Now, this title is important because the title which Ishan Varman uses for the previous Maukhari rulers is Maharaj. So, this adoption of this title of Maharajadhiraj by Ishan Varman suggests that Ishan Varman wanted to show that he is no longer the feudatory of the Imperial Guptas. And we see that during the period of 4th and 5th decade of 6th century AD, which was most likely the period in which Ishan Varman ruled, we see that he did not only adopt this title of Maharajadhiraj, but he also pursued an expansionist policy. This bid of the Maukharis to expand their power did not go unchallenged, and it appears that the Aulikaras, who were their former allies, did try to invade the Maukhari territory. The evidence of this comes from an inscription which is called the Jaunpur inscription. This inscription is not complete, but there is a sentence in this inscription which provide us some clue about this Aulikara invasion in the Maukhari territory. The line reads like this: a spark that had come by the road from the city of Dhara. Dhara, we all know, is in the Malwa region, and during this time the Malwa region was under the control of the Aulikaras. So this spark that had come by the road from the city of Dhara was a reference to an Aulikara invasion that did not succeed. And it also shows that the short-lived alliance between the Aulikaras and the Maukharis that was created for the fight against Mihirkula was also short-lived, and when Mihirkula was defeated, the Maukharis and the Aulikaras started to fight with each other. Now coming back to the Maukharis, after defeating this Aulikara invasion, we see that during the reign of Ishan Varman, the expansionist policy of the Maukharis continued, and the subsequent victories of Ishan Varman is documented in an inscription which is called the Hadaha inscription. Here, Maharajadhiraj Ishan Varman tells us that he gained victories over three powers. These three powers were the Andras, the Sulicas, and the Gaudas. So who these three powers were? Let's start with the Andras. The Hadaha inscription tells us that the army of the Lord of the Andras had exceptionally large number of elephants. Most scholars believe that this Lord of the Andras was none other than the Vishnukundin ruler Indravarman, or who is also known as Indrabhattaraka Varman, who ruled from 526 AD to 555 AD. And from the inscription, it appears that the clash between the Maukharis and the Vishnukundins took place between the Vindhya mountains, as this was the natural boundary of these two powers. The result of this conflict in terms of territorial conquest was not that much, but it does appear that there was a matrimonial alliance that happened between the Maukharis and the Vishnukundins. And some scholars argue that the son of Ishan Varman, Sharva Varman, married a daughter of the Vishnukundin ruler Indravarman. Now coming to the second power which is mentioned in the Hada inscription, the Sulicas, we find that there is a great debate among scholars about who these Sulicas were. The Hada inscription tells us that the Sulicas had innumerable number of horses. Now because of this information, some scholars have argued that these Sulicas were none other than the Hunas or Huns. Now this identification of the Sulicas with the Huns is not accepted by other scholars. They argue that if we look at the Jaunpur inscription, we find that the term Sulika is not mentioned. Instead, we have the term Huna. But when we look at the Hadaha inscription, we see that the term Huna is not mentioned. Instead, we have the term Sulikas. Now, if both of these terms are same, then why in one inscription we have the term Sulika and in the other we have the term Huna? So, both of these terms are not the same as some scholars have argued. Now, we find that in a text called Brihat Samhita, there is a term which is quite close to the term Sulika. This term is Shulika. So the term Shulika and Sulika are most likely the same. Now Brihat Samhita tells us that these Shulikas lived in the region of northwest. And interestingly, Brihat Samhita also mentions Hunas. So it appears that these Shulikas were different from the Hunas, and some scholars have argued that these Shulikas were a different Central Asian tribe that lived during this time in northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent. Now interestingly, in an inscription of the Aulikara ruler Yashoda Varman, we are told that Yashoda Varman went to war with the flying banners of Shulapani. So if, as some scholars have argued, Shulapani is closer or is similar to Shulikas, then it would mean that some Indian powers deployed these Central Asian tribes who are called Shulikas in their army. And it also suggests that Ishan Varman had defeated these Shulikas or Sulikas, as the Hada inscription tells us. The third power which is mentioned in the Hada inscription, which was defeated by Ishan Varman, are the Gaudas. Now, Gauda here, according to most scholars, are the Imperial Guptas and the later Guptas. The later Guptas should not be confused with the Imperial Guptas. The later Guptas started off as a feudatory of the Imperial Guptas, but during the middle of 6th century AD, we see that their status has increased and now they shared power with the imperial Guptas, and these two powers controlled jointly the region of Magadh and Bengal. The Hada inscription tells us that Ishan Varman, because of his might, drove the Gaudas from their territory, and these Gaudas took refuge at the ocean. Now, this means that most likely Ishan Varman conquered the region of Magadh, and now the territory of the later Guptas and the imperial Guptas was restricted to the Gauda proper. In this war against the later Guptas and the imperial Guptas, it appears that Ishan Varman got help from a junior branch of the Maukharis that controlled the Gaya region. Earlier, most likely, this junior branch of the Maukharis were the feudatory of the later Guptas and the imperial Guptas. But when the invasion of the Maukharis of Kannauj began, we see that these Maukharis of Gaya shifted their alliance, and now they supported their senior branch that had started to invade the Magadhan territory. For the later Guptas, this war against the Maukharis was a bloody one. We learn from a later inscription that the later Gupta ruler Damodar Gupta died while fighting against the Maukharis, and his father Kumar Gupta also committed suicide because of the later Gupta defeat. With this victory over the imperial Guptas and the later Guptas, the Maukharis now controlled the region of Magadh. One thing we should also note here is that in the Hada inscription, Ishan Varman does not call these imperial Guptas and the later Guptas the ruler of Magadh. He calls them Gaudas. Calling them the king of Magadh would mean that this territory of Magadh, which is now under the control of Ishan Varman, was illegally occupied by the Maukharis. So because of this, Ishan Varman calls the imperial Guptas and the later Guptas Gaudas. It is also possible that only after gaining control of Magadh did Ishan Varman call himself Maharajadhiraj. This title suited him because now the Maukharis controlled a large chunk of northern India. The victories of Maukharis under Ishan Varman brought stability to this region after a century, and the capital of this rising power was Kannauj. During the reign of Ishan Varman's sons and grandson Sharva Varman and Avanti Varman, we will see that Kannauj will become the political and cultural center of northern India. Now, if you want to know about the Aulikaras who had earlier fought with the Maukharis, do watch this video. Thank you for watching.